Imperial guards found him in an abandoned villa's wine cellar, 20 years old, clutching a vial of poison. This was Sporus, once the Empress of Rome, choosing death over what awaited him in the Colosseum. To understand why death seemed like mercy, we must go back 3 years, to when a grieving, half-mad emperor first saw a teenage boy who looked exactly like his dead wife. This isn't just another tale of Roman excess. This is the most disturbing case of identity theft in human history. The thief didn't steal a name or fortune. He stole an entire person's existence, surgically erasing one life to resurrect another. Everything you're about to hear comes from official Roman records. The Murder Rome, 65 AD. Emperor Nero has just murdered his pregnant wife, Poppaea Sabina. Not through war or execution. Those were everyday occurrences. He killed her with his own hands in their private chambers. Some sources describe a single devastating kick to her swollen belly. Others report a brutal beating that left her hemorrhaging on marble floors, while Nero screamed for physicians who couldn't reverse death. Poppaea Sabina wasn't just any imperial wife. She was Nero's obsession, his muse. Contemporary accounts describe almost supernatural beauty. Amber hair that caught light like spun gold, pale, luminous skin, and enormous doe-like eyes that poets compared to Venus herself. But Nero's grief wasn't normal mourning. When you command 60 million souls, when you've been told since childhood you're descended from gods, death becomes a personal insult from the universe, a boundary that dares to exist when you recognize no boundaries. Nero refused traditional cremation. He had her body embalmed with more spices than Arabia produced in a year, dressed in her finest robes, placed in a crystal sarcophagus where he could see her. Palace servants found him having conversations with the corpse, setting places for her at dinner, asking her opinion on matters of state. The court physicians tried to explain that grief manifests strangely. But Nero wasn't grieving. He was fracturing. Sleep became impossible. He woke screaming her name, convinced he heard her calling. Food tasted like ash, unless prepared as she liked it. He ordered her chambers preserved exactly as she left them, down to the position of her hairbrush. Then the visions began. 2 months after her death, Nero started seeing Poppaea everywhere. In slave girls bringing wine, in senators' wives at the games, in prostitutes on the streets. He would stop mid-sentence during state meetings, staring at women who bore even slight resemblances. More than once, he terrified innocent women by grabbing their faces, turning them toward light, searching desperately for something that wasn't there. The imperial household held its breath. The madness only intensified. Nero commissioned hundreds of paintings and sculptures, demanding artists capture not just her appearance, but her essence. When they inevitably failed, he flew into rages, ordering artists beaten, sometimes weeping like a child. Then came late 65 AD. Everything changed. The discovery? Nero was reviewing administrative appointments, a mind-numbing task he usually delegated. A young freedman, recently promoted to a minor clerical position, was brought forward. The emperor looked up. Time stopped. The boy standing before him, no more than 15, had Poppaea's eyes. Not similar eyes. The exact same enormous, dark-lashed eyes that had captivated Nero from their first meeting. The same delicate bone structure. The same unconscious head tilt when nervous. Even the same amber flecks in the irises. Nero rose so quickly that scrolls scattered. The court held its breath as the emperor circled the terrified boy like a predator studying prey. But there was something else in Nero's expression: desperate hope, manic joy that was somehow more frightening than rage. "What is your name?" Nero's voice barely whispered. "Sporus, Divine Augustus. I am Sporus." Sporus wasn't just any slave. He'd been born into the imperial household. His mother, a Germanic captive who died in childbirth. Raised in the palace's servant quarters. Educated alongside freedmen's children in Greek, Latin, mathematics, and rhetoric. His delicate features and intelligence had marked him for administrative service. None of that mattered now. In that moment, Sporus ceased to exist as an individual. He became a canvas for an emperor's delusion. Nero's examination continued. He touched the boy's face, turned it to catch different angles of light, ran fingers through his hair. Sporus stood frozen, intelligent enough to understand his life balanced on a knife's edge, but not yet comprehending the full horror ahead. Finally, Nero stepped back. The smile spreading across his face was described by one chronicler as the expression of a man who has discovered the secret of defeating death itself. "Cancel today's appointments," Nero commanded. "Summon my personal physicians. Tell them to prepare their finest chambers and sharpest instruments. We have work to do." The transformation didn't begin with surgery. First, Nero needed to study his subject. For days, Sporus was kept in luxurious chambers adjacent to Nero's own, subjected to endless examinations and measurements. The emperor brought in artists who had painted Poppaea from life. They created comparative sketches, noting where Sporus matched the dead Empress and where he differed. Nero pored over these studies like sacred texts, making notations, planning modifications. But it wasn't just physical appearance Nero analyzed. He had Sporus speak for hours, listening to his voice, correcting pronunciation, teaching him Poppaea's distinctive vowel patterns. He tested the boy's walk, his gestures, how he held his hands. The psychological torture had already begun. Sporus was forbidden to use his own name. Servants addressed him as lady or mistress. Simple tunics were replaced with flowing robes in Poppaea's favorite colors. He learned to apply elaborate makeup, not the simple touches of Roman youth, but the full cosmetics of noble women. Imagine waking each morning, looking in polished bronze mirrors, watching your own face systematically erased. Servants reported he barely spoke, barely ate, moved through days like someone in a waking nightmare. But he didn't resist. How could he? One word of complaint meant death, or worse. Because by now, Sporus had learned Nero's plan. The emperor spoke of it openly, excitedly, like an artist describing a masterpiece in progress. Physicians had been consulted. Procedures explained. Sporus would be physically transformed into a woman through castration and surgical modification. Not just removing masculinity. Roman eunuchs were common enough. This was unprecedented. An attempt to surgically create a woman from a man. To rebuild Sporus's body into an approximation of feminine form. The physicians, threatened with death if they refused, and promised rewards if they succeeded, devised procedures far beyond simple castration. The night before surgery, Nero visited Sporus's chambers. He brought a small wooden box containing Poppaea's wedding ring, a massive emerald surrounded by pearls. "Tomorrow," Nero said, sliding the ring onto Sporus's finger where it hung loosely, "you will be reborn. You will become who you were always meant to be. And I will love you as I loved her." Sporus finally spoke, voice barely audible. "Will it hurt?" For just a moment, something almost human flickered in Nero's eyes. Then it vanished. "Birth always hurts," he replied, "but what emerges is beautiful." The surgery lasted hours. Screams could be heard 3 corridors away, despite thick walls. Nero paced outside like an expectant father, occasionally shouting encouragement. Recovery took months. Infection was a constant threat. The modifications were extensive. Sporus had to relearn basic functions. Through it all, Nero supervised the healing, adjusting pain medications, even changing bandages with his own imperial hands. This tender care might seem touching, but remember its purpose. Nero wasn't nursing a person back to health. He was crafting an object to fulfill his obsession. If you're finding this story as disturbing and compelling as we are, leave your thoughts in the comments. We're curious whether you've encountered this chapter of Roman history before. And if you're engaged with this investigation into the darker corners of history, consider liking this video. It helps us bring more hidden stories to light. The performance. As Sporus healed, an army of tutors descended. He learned to walk in smaller, swaying steps considered proper for Roman matrons. His hands were trained to move with studied grace, to hold wine cups delicately, to gesture in restrained, feminine manner. Voice training was perhaps most intensive. Hour after hour, Sporus practiced speaking in higher, softer tones. He learned Poppaea's favorite phrases, her way of laughing, her specific intonations when addressing court members. A wardrobe was commissioned. Not just women's clothing, exact replicas of Poppaea's favorite garments. Imperial seamstresses recreated her iconic dresses. Jewelers reset her collection to fit Sporus's proportions. Even her perfumes were recreated with the same rare oils and resins. But clothes and jewels were just the beginning. Sporus learned the complex rituals of a Roman noblewoman's day. Hours-long beauty routines, elaborate hairstyling requiring teams of servants. The proper way to recline at dinner parties. Nero didn't just want Sporus to look and act like Poppaea. He wanted him to be Poppaea. The boy was required to study her history, her childhood in Pompeii, her first marriage, her rise through Roman society. He memorized names of her friends, her favorite foods, her opinions on poetry and politics. When Nero reminisced about shared experiences, Sporus had to respond as if he remembered them too. The first public appearance came 6 months after surgery. A small dinner party, just Nero's closest advisors and their wives. When Sporus entered in one of Poppaea's distinctive purple gowns, her jewelry glittering, conversation stopped mid-sentence. Everyone had heard rumors, but seeing the transformation was something else entirely. The resemblance was uncanny. In soft lighting with expertly applied cosmetics, Sporus looked eerily like the dead Empress, the way he moved, the head tilt, the smile. It was all Poppaea. Or rather, it was a performance so complete that even cynical courtiers momentarily forgot the truth. Nero beamed like an artist revealing his masterpiece. He kept one hand possessively on Sporus throughout the evening, introducing him as "my beloved Sabina," Poppaea's family name. The guests, masters of political survival, played along with hysterical enthusiasm. They complimented Sabina's beauty, asked after her health, included her in conversations, as if the last months had been a strange dream and Poppaea had never died. But you can't fool everyone forever. Tacitus, writing years later, recorded keen observations. Sporus's hands, despite treatments, remained slightly too large. His shoulders beneath flowing fabric retained masculine broadness. Occasionally, when he forgot himself, his natural voice broke through practiced tones. More heartbreaking were glimpses of Sporus's own personality. Witnesses described catching flashes of sharp intelligence, dry wit, profound sadness that had nothing to do with Poppaea. But these moments were quickly suppressed. Any deviation from the role meant punishment, not physical abuse, which might mar the illusion, but psychological torment. Nero would grow cold, withdraw affection, threaten to find a better Poppaea if this one couldn't perform adequately. Then came the wedding announcement, early 67 AD, proclaimed throughout Rome as if it were completely normal for the emperor to marry his surgically feminized teenage freedman. The ceremony would be a full state occasion. Every traditional Roman ritual, every senator, magistrate, and foreign dignitary in Rome was invited. Declining was not an option. The wedding day was surreal. Sporus wore the traditional saffron veil of a Roman bride. Ceremonial cosmetics painted his face. The dowry, a massive fortune, was formally transferred. Contracts were signed with identical legal language used for any marriage. Despite biological impossibility of producing heirs, Nero performed his role with disturbing sincerity. Traditional rituals, ancient vows. He even carried Sporus over the threshold as custom prescribed. The wedding feast was lavish beyond description. Peacocks stuffed with songbirds, wine from Caesar's own cellars, entertainment by the empire's finest musicians and dancers. Throughout, the Roman elite maintained frozen smiles and offered congratulations. Gifts poured in, jewelry, household goods, even fertility amulets. Whether dark humor or desperate attempts to please, no one could say. Senators gave speeches praising the bride's beauty. Poets composed wedding songs celebrating the union. Behind the facade, everyone understood they witnessed something unprecedented and deeply wrong. Not just another of Nero's excesses, a fundamental violation of Roman values, natural law, and human dignity. Yet they applauded, smiled, toasted. Because the alternative was death. Life as Nero's Empress was a daily performance that never ended. Sporus woke each morning in Poppaea's chambers, surrounded by her possessions. Servants who once attended the real Poppaea now dressed him in her clothes, styled his hair, applied cosmetics to maintain the illusion. Public appearances were perhaps worst. Nero insisted on taking his new wife everywhere: theater, races, religious ceremonies, state functions. Sporus sat in the Empress's box at the Colosseum, rode in the Empress's litter through streets, received ceremonial honors due an Augusta. During Nero's grand tour of Greece in 67 AD, the performance reached new heights. Greeks eager to please their Roman conquerors treated Sporus with all deference due an empress. He presided over banquets, attended Nero's artistic performances, participated in religious ceremonies reserved for the emperor's wife. In Olympia, priests prayed for the couple to be blessed with children, maintaining the fiction even in the face of biological impossibility. In private moments, the true horror became clear. Nero expected him to respond to intimacy not just as a woman, but as Poppaea specifically. He had to know her preferences, mirror her responses, recreate private jokes and tender moments that had belonged to a dead woman. Any failure could send Nero into violent rage, or worse, cold disappointment that felt like death itself to someone whose survival depended entirely on pleasing a madman. Historical accounts suggest that over time, Sporus developed what we might now recognize as severe dissociative disorder. He began referring to himself as Poppaea, even when not in Nero's presence. Servants reported finding him having conversations with mirrors, speaking in two voices, his own and the feminine persona he'd been forced to adopt. The boundaries between Sporus and the role he played became increasingly blurred, perhaps the only way his mind could cope. The fall-spring of 68 AD, Nero's world collapsed. rebellions erupted across the empire. The Senate declared him an enemy of the state. The Praetorian Guard abandoned him. As Nero fled Rome with only a handful of loyal servants, Sporus was among them. Even facing death, the emperor couldn't leave behind his artificial Poppaea. Those final days in a villa outside Rome were pure madness. Nero alternated between grandiose escape plans and theatrical suicide preparations. Through it all, Sporus remained by his side, still playing devoted wife even as the empire crumbled. Witnesses described Nero clinging to Sporus, calling him "my only love, my resurrection," begging him to die together like ancient tragic lovers. When news came that capture was imminent, Nero finally chose death. But even in his last moments, the performance continued. He asked Sporus to begin ritual lamentations, to mourn him as Poppaea would have mourned. As Nero pressed the dagger to his throat with trembling hands, Sporus helped guide it. Perhaps the only genuinely merciful act in their entire twisted relationship. With Nero dead, Sporus's nightmare should have ended. Instead, it entered a new phase. He was now a living symbol of Nero's excesses, a valuable prize for whoever claimed power next. The generals fighting for the throne each saw him differently, as trophy, curiosity, potential legitimizing link to the previous regime, or simply as an object of fascination. First came Galba, who treated Sporus with cold courtesy. For a few months, Sporus lived in strange twilight, still dressed as a woman, still called Sabina, but without the intense focus of Nero's obsession. Galba's reign lasted only 7 months before he was murdered in the Forum. His successor, Otho, had known Poppaea personally. She had been his wife before Nero stole her. Otho's interest in Sporus was particularly disturbing. Did he see an echo of his lost love? A chance for revenge against Nero's memory? Sources suggest Otho treated Sporus as a legitimate widow, even promising marriage. But his reign was too brief for this plan to materialize. When Otho committed suicide after losing the Battle of Bedriacum, Sporus passed to the victor, Vitellius. And it was under Vitellius that Sporus's story reached its final, brutal chapter. Vitellius was a different kind of emperor, crude, gluttonous, caring nothing for refined cruelties. To him, Sporus was neither person nor valuable object, but potential entertainment for the mob. Vitellius announced that Sporus would perform in a public spectacle at the Colosseum, not as spectator in the imperial box, but as participant in the games. The plan was hideously creative. Sporus would be forced to reenact the myth of Proserpina, the maiden abducted by Pluto to the underworld. In this fatal performance, he would be abducted by gladiators dressed as demons and subjected to public rape before being killed. When Sporus learned of this plan, he finally found strength that had eluded him for years. Rather than submit to this final degradation, he chose death on his own terms. The exact method is debated. Some sources say poison. Others suggest he opened his veins in the traditional Roman manner, but all agree he died by his own hand, finally escaping the role he'd been forced to play. He was approximately 20 years old. The tragedy of Sporus raises profound questions about identity, autonomy, and the corruption of absolute power. Here was a person systematically destroyed and rebuilt to serve another's delusion. Every aspect of his existence, physical, psychological, social, was violated and reshaped. He became a living ghost, forced to impersonate someone he'd never met, to love someone who had destroyed him. What makes his story particularly haunting is how completely we've lost the real Sporus. We don't know his thoughts, his dreams, his personality before Nero's attention fell upon him. That person was so thoroughly erased that even his name is uncertain. Sporus itself might have been a cruel nickname meaning seed or sown thing, emphasizing his transformation. The boy who entered Nero's presence that day effectively ceased to exist, replaced by a performance that continued until death finally released him. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect is how many people were complicit. The physicians who performed the surgery, the tutors who trained him, the courtiers who pretended he was Poppaea, the servants who dressed him each day. Hundreds of people participated in maintaining this cruel fiction. Each prioritized their own survival over the humanity of a teenage boy. The story of Sporus serves as a reminder that power without conscience creates horrors beyond imagination. When reality itself becomes subject to authorities' whims, when human beings become raw material for others' fantasies, when entire societies participate in obvious fictions to appease tyrants, the results are invariably tragic. In the grand narrative of Roman history, Sporus is often reduced to a footnote, just another example of Nero's excesses. But he was a human being whose life was stolen, whose identity was erased, whose body was mutilated, whose every waking moment became a performance in someone else's tragedy. He deserves to be remembered not just as a victim, but as a person who endured unimaginable circumstances and, finally, in his last act, chose freedom over further degradation. The ruins of Nero's palace still stand in Rome, buried beneath later constructions. Somewhere in those ruins are the chambers where Sporus lived his stolen life, where he stood before mirrors reflecting back a stranger, where he practiced speaking in a voice not his own. The stones remember, even if history has largely forgotten. If this investigation into one of history's darkest chapters has affected you, we'd value your perspective in the comments below. These are the stories that reveal the extremes of human behavior, both its capacity for cruelty and its capacity for endurance. If you believe these hidden histories deserve a wider audience, please share this video. And for more investigations into the untold corners of the past, subscribe to the channel. There are more forgotten voices waiting to be heard.